In Missoula, Montana, a series of lines etched into the mountains tell a little-known, epic Ice Age tale. Okay, well, I'm in Missoula, Montana, and this is the start of an epic journey that I'll be taking for the next month, following the path of a series of floods that happened from right here in Missoula, Montana, and spread all the way through eastern Washington, tearing the landscape to pieces, through the Columbia Gorge with a 1,000-foot tall wall of water, and then into the Pacific Ocean. These floods happened over and over again, at least 40 times we have accounts of, and they're some of the most just spectacular geological events that very, very few people know about, and yet they shape the landscape that millions of people live in. So I'm going to be starting this journey right here in Missoula, where the ancient glacial Lake Missoula once existed, half the size of Lake Michigan, and 15,000 years ago, catastrophically drained. And over the next month, I'm going to be telling you these stories as I follow the path that epic event occurred in. So come join me. This is going to be a lot of fun. 15,000 years ago, the ice dam that created the giant glacial Lake Missoula violently burst and sent a titanic torrent of water into the Pacific Ocean, violently tearing apart the landscape in its path. Stories of an Ice Age cataclysm. Scars in the mountains hold the memories. Where the Clark Fork River is now quiet, deafening thunder once roared. Join me on an epic adventure following the path of water turned violent, chasing Lake Missoula. That night, I set up my tent and in the morning set off to an utterly spectacular marvel of geology. Everywhere the Lake Missoula Floods went, the landscape bears the scars. Here on the Flathead Reservation, you can find a truly mind-boggling sight brought by these raging waters. In the vast open valley by Camas Prairie, you can find giant ripples brought by the floodwaters at a scale that truly boggles the mind. Ripples rising over 35 feet from the valley ground. Ice Age echoes etched in the mind. Place truly larger than life. An untold story of epic wonder. One of the things that I find so amazing about following the path of Lake Missoula is once you know what you're looking for, just how much it comes to life. You can really see these vast flows of water going down the hill and rippling around, and just imagining the entire lake losing its status as a lake and going into the destiny of the Pacific Ocean and just tearing the landscape around it. And you can just feel it. It's a presence almost. It's just this amazing event, the consequences of which are locked in the landscape right here for me to film and bring to you. And I've still got hundreds and hundreds of miles of this to go. It really is just incredible. From the ripples of the Camas Prairie, I followed the waters west towards Thompson Falls. Thompson Falls, you can find a dam in the Clark Fork River, harnessing its power for our use. Seeing the remnants of the Missoula Floods, I couldn't help but smile. There was no controlling what came down the gorge that day. So before I jump into the bulk of the video here, I really want to kind of tell you the basic story of the Lake Missoula Floods and what happened. And I can't really think of a better place to do that than this lake right here, because this is the site of the ice dam that formed Lake Missoula. So you know about the ice ages, something like starting 50,000 years ago, the world got very cold, and vast sheets of ice, thousands of feet tall, stretched all the way across the North Pole, down through Canada, and it had little sections that went down into the United States, including this area right here in northern Idaho. And when the ice sheets expanded, they crossed the Clark Fork River with a 2,000-foot wall of ice. And so what happens when a river runs into an obstacle that it can't flow through? It builds a lake. It just starts to pool up, and the water just finds all of the possible outlets until it can't flow anymore, and then it just starts to build. And this particular damming of the Clark Fork River created a vast glacial lake, half the size of Lake Michigan. It's just this vast, vast lake that stretched all the way from northern Idaho to western Montana and beyond. And it just held an incredible amount of water. And right here is the site of how the Lake Missoula Floods happened. Because something really funny happens when you take water and ice right next to each other. When the water gets to 90% of the level of the ice will start to float. It'll move upward to sit on top of the water. And that's exactly what happened with the Lake Missoula Floods. 15,000 years ago, the water level at this area got to 2,000 feet tall, and that was enough to cause the southern section of this glacial ice sheet to start to rise. And if it starts to rise and the rest of it doesn't give way, it starts to crack. And that's exactly what happened here 2,000 years ago, is that the ice dam that was blocking up this gigantic lake, Lake Missoula, broke. A sheet of ice snapped, and a torrent of water, the size of half of Lake Michigan, began to cascade down the mountainsides, through the Rockies, and out into the Pacific Ocean. And that's what you see right here. And so with that, let's jump into today's journey. In the mountains of northern Idaho, the woods hold secrets of an epic, ancient story. Fractured rocks line the trail from mountains that have seen much. Ice Age memories lost in time. follow the trail and the mountain's secrets are revealed. This was the place where 500 cubic miles of water fought with towering cliffs of ice. And at its peak, the water prevailed. Lake Missoula was free. Man, it is just so amazing being somewhere like this. You know, this is a historic site. I mean, it's a beautiful lake, and it would still be beautiful if you knew nothing about the Lake Missoula Floods. But once you do, once you picture the 2,000-foot tall wall of ice that would be found here, and the giant, giant lake to the east, and just imagine that water seeping underneath and starting to rise the ice, just all of the deafening cracks and just thunderous roars of nature doing what nature does. It's just incredible. And thinking about how much of the Northwest was shaped by this event that first started 15,000 years ago. And as I mentioned before, it then happened repeatedly. Something like every 50 years, the water would be slightly lower because temperatures were rising and the ice sheets were melting, but every time that 90% threshold was reached, the ice cracked and the water cascaded through, carrying huge chunks of ice and boulders that weigh over 100 tons that were carried by the Lake Missoula floodwaters. So this is just, it exceeds human comprehension, and I really hope that between this information and the cinematic nature of it, and just my general passion for nature and these amazing events, you can relive some of what happened. And if you live in the areas that were carved by Lake Missoula Floods, you can just be thankful that the place you call home was created by this catastrophic event 15,000 years ago. It's just amazing. Okay, well, I'm in the Washington scablands, and this is a really dramatic part of the Lake Missoula story. So the Lake Missoula, when the ice dam collapsed, flowed southwestward and ran into a separate glacial lake called Glacial Lake Columbia. Glacial Lake Missoula kept going through. It pounded into the water and flew out of the basin and began pouring outward. And as much as the landscape in Montana and Idaho were dramatically affected, the landscapes in the scablands in particular are astonishing. Washington as a landscape was dramatically affected by what are called the Columbia flood basalts. And flood basalts are these amazing, amazing geologic events where the earth begins to spew forth the liquid magma across these giant vents that may be 50 miles or more long and just spread out from these cracks underneath the surface. And the number I read that just absolutely blows my mind is that from these flood basalts, there'll be as much as 10,000 square miles of landscape covered in lava in as little as a week. So it's just pouring out these liquid magma and just covering vast areas of Washington. And Lake Missoula interacted with this basalt in a really dramatic way, because compared to a lot of the rock in Montana, this basalt comes apart fairly easily. And Lake Missoula had so much power to it that it just tore apart the landscape in eastern Washington, opening all these gigantic lakes and just creating all these obvious scars on the surface. And a lot of the fertile soil that used to exist here was completely stripped away and moved to Oregon. It really is just such a dramatic scene. The scablands are a place where the fury of the Lake Missoula Floods can be profoundly felt. Everywhere you look, you see the earth turn scarred. A broken, battered land, appearing diseased from its plight. The chaotic brutality of the floods come to life from the sky. Columns of lava worn away to nothingness. Walking through the destruction of the scablands, one can't help but wonder what came before. In places spared by the flood's wrath, you find a different world, rolling fertile hills free of the devastation. From a verdant domain to something very, very different. The canyon at Palouse Falls is a dramatic example of the flood's earth-shattering power. A landscape sundered apart by raging water. This canyon tells much more than the river running through it. A place of dramatic wonder. You know, I've got to say, it is just so spectacularly amazing being out here. You're so used to seeing some of these canyons and thinking the relationship between the stream body or the river body and what constructed the canyon. Over here, it's very different. This is almost a comical mismatch. There's this relatively tiny creek going through this vast, vast chasm. And this is just the most blatant, the most in-your-face outcome of the Lake Missoula Floods, just showing off their power at just such a grandiose scale. It's really incredible just imagining the vast muddy walls of water flying through this place and listening to the falls, but knowing just how little this particular river system had to do with constructing what you see out here, and knowing that there was just this vast epic force in the waiting that just came down this gorge over and over and over again, 15,000 to 13,000 years ago. Just such an amazing experience to be here. Until the next time we explore these floods together, wander in wonder. The Lake Missoula Floods were, in a word, epic, ruthlessly, unfathomably vast and powerful. Okay, well, I'm at an area in eastern Washington called the Grand Coulee area, and this is, I think, one of the most spectacular parts of the Lake Missoula Floods. The floodwaters basically ran into another glacial lake called Glacial Lake Columbia, just sort of flew through the area. You know, Glacial Lake Columbia certainly didn't have enough space to hold Glacial Lake Missoula, and the deep, thick muds of Glacial Lake Missoula just kind of kept powering through, flying out of Glacial Lake Columbia and out into this area called the Grand Coulee. And if you look around in the Grand Coulee, you'll see these cliffs separated by many miles, these gigantic columns of lava separated by many miles with this kind of flat region in between. And believe it or not, that was the size of these kinds of floods that we're talking about. These are water bodies that are literal miles wide, carving out these vast areas. Everything about the Lake Missoula Floods are just so intense and beautiful at the same time. Kind of like me. I don't know if I'll keep that in there or not. In the Grand Coulee, it's easy to feel dwarfed in the enormity of what came every time the ice dam fell. A disaster that created a world. Okay, well, I'm at Northrop Canyon, which is one of the many, many trails in the Grand Coulee area where the Lake Missoula Floods' vast power starts to become very, very apparent. Just these amazing, huge mud flows and vast, vast amounts of the basalt rock carved out of the earth. So I know very little about this trail other than the fact that it's absolutely beautiful. There's apparently a cabin of some kind, old house at the end, but that's about all I know. Time for some adventure. Following the floods truly brings the past to life. Boulders strewn in the ground are silent monuments to Ice Age enormity. Walking through the gorge, I couldn't help but wonder if those who lived in the shelter of its walls could sense the magnitude of what once passed. Seeing the lava cliffs tower above me, I was struck by the contrast. Ancient fire exposed to the sun by vast, muddy waters. Beneath that fire, a family lived for nearly a century. Cycles of creation and destruction. Wonders to be found when chasing Lake Missoula. In the plains of East Washington, you can find signs of a vast, ancient wonder. Well, I'm in Dry Falls State Park, and this was one of the places that really first inspired this entire filming journey of telling the story of the Lake Missoula Floods. Dry Falls are so called because they were a massive waterfall that now has no water at all. When the Lake Missoula Floods came through, they fell off of this precipice. And this particular waterfall is the largest waterfall we know having existed. It's 3.5 miles wide, in places 400 feet tall. And the Lake Missoula Floods would have just fallen down as a roiling, muddy mess, jumping off of the cliff and just pummeling the landscape below. You know, if you were there, you would be able to feel the falls and hear them from such a long distance away, 10 times the flow of all the world's rivers combined, flying off of this cliff face that extends for 3.5 miles. So it's just this epic event of the ice ages that it just feels so good to be here and bring it to life. Walking through the canyon by dry falls, volcanic boulders litter the ground as echoes of now silent catastrophe. The landscape whispers stories of an ancient wall of water. Peace in the shadow of cataclysm. Here, Lake Missoula put its might on full display. Looking at the torn chunks of rock, I couldn't help but feel like I was walking through a battlefield that time forgot. Thousands of years ago, this was the site of one of our planet's wonders, a titanic waterfall that dwarfs the thought of any other. Here, thunder roared as 3.5 miles of water launched into the depths below. An Ice Age titan, making the ground tremble. Through vast erosional forces, the falls tore the landscape to pieces, migrating 15 miles from where they once stood. And so I walked through a realm of time-frozen memories. Lake Missoula stampeded its way through here for the last time 13,000 years ago, and it is this final event, long dormant and silent, that I bring to life to your eyes. I am chasing Lake Missoula. This place is so utterly mind-blowing. It's so wild that, you know, the classic notion in geology is those of processes that you see today taking place over huge amounts of time. You know, rivers flowing, and through that flow, eventually wearing down vast chasms. And the events that occurred here with the Lake Missoula Floods in Washington, this landscape was just sundered. You know, it's like an angry god took its fist and slammed it into the landscape and rock went everywhere, right? All the soils are gone and, you know, many layers of volcanic rock were eroded in an instant. It's astonishing. And right here, I'm sitting just underneath the world's largest waterfall at one point in time. 3.5 miles wide. You can just see it. It goes all across the horizon, off in that direction. And the water would have just flown off of that, gotten into this gorge, and then just proceeded to tear apart the landscape, barely recognizing that it took a steep drop. Hell-bent on the Pacific Ocean. What a place. What an event. It's fitting to think of Dry Falls as a monument to the epic forces of nature. In reverie, this is my temple. Okay, well, I'm at Hartford Reach National Monument, and this is a place in the Lake Missoula story where a giant temporary lake was formed. Because when you have a water body the size of Lake Missoula, sometimes you'll run into bottlenecks. The lake will flow into places where only a certain amount of water can come through, in this case, into the Columbia Gorge. And so while that water began to drain through that bottleneck, Lake Missoula formed a temporary lake called Lake Lewis that was 60 miles tall and 120 miles wide. It went all the way from Yakima to Walla Walla and then north to Soap Lake. And the Columbia River, which you see right here, was right in the middle of this lake. And it was the Columbia River that would dictate the ultimate fate of Lake Missoula, where Lake Missoula just followed the Columbia River all the way to the Pacific Ocean. If there's one thing the Lake Missoula floods have taught me, it's that the distant past is often right at hand. Stories of the ice ages surround you, and they whisper to those who listen. Chasing Lake Missoula expands the heart as much as the mind. Playing in the sands of time. You know, something really funny about this stage of the Lake Missoula journey is so much of the landscape that I've been going through, there's just this feel of like geologic violence, right? I know it's a word that I somewhat overuse in the narration, violent, but it's an accurate word. It's just something that just takes the landscape and just dramatically tears it to pieces. And this area, where the Lake Missoula was temporarily slowed into a giant lake that drained out in very dramatic fashion through the Columbia Gorge. We'll talk about that later, but we're talking over 1,000-foot tall walls of water that were carving out the gorge. This place is just almost just serene. It's calm and relaxing, and you can see that not too long ago, within 15,000 years, this place was a big, big lake, 65 miles by 120 miles. I enjoyed this hike up here. But the serenity of the waters at Lake Lewis would not last, and in a matter of days, they were destined for the Pacific Ocean. Okay, time for another trail hike. This is up the McBee Trail in southeastern Washington, just about at the point where the Lake Missoula Floods went through a narrow gorge on the way to the Columbia Gorge. So just gonna go wander this thing and see what cool stuff we can find up here. The Horse Heaven Hills are a place that strikingly reveals how the Lake Missoula Floods crafted our world. Each step a a step away from ancient raging waters. Look down and you see the old valley of the Yakima River, forced to change course after the floods filled its weaving waters with turbulent debris. And from the summit, on the other side, you can see a far gentler world. So there we have another example of what happens when the Lake Missoula Floods didn't hit an area. This mountain I just climbed, I think is about 1,100 feet tall. And just by looking at the landscape, you can tell, and you can see the scars in the hillside where the mud flows and water flows move through, dragging giant rocks and glacial pieces of ice. And then you look at just the other side there, and you just have a vast, open, rolling prairie. But just on the other side of those mountains, you can find another temporary lake. You know, the glacial Lake Missoula story is one of pulses of violence into these gigantic temporary lakes that would only last for a week or so as the water drained, interrupted by another dramatic journey through a choke point into another temporary lake. And one of those temporary lakes is just on the horizon there, just past this open farm country. And that's where I'm going to be soon. You know, very soon I'm going to be passing through where the Columbia River goes through a choke point and the water's emptied from Lake Lewis. And as you can imagine, when you have water that's many, many hundreds of feet and moving at 65 miles an hour through this tiny choke point, it's going to be some dramatic scenery. I'm excited to move through that area, get into the next temporary lake, but we've got quite a lot to go yet. It's going to be a good time. Looking down from the Horseheaven Hills, it's easy to recognize a simple truth. In the Pacific Northwest, millions live under Lake Missoula's shadow. And with these videos, I bring that truth to life. Scars in the mountains tell their stories for those who know to listen. Okay, well, next stage of the journey. I'm currently at a place called the Wallula Gap in southeastern Washington into northeastern Oregon. And this is a place where the floods drained when they formed the temporary Lake Lewis. And the Wallula Gap is the area where that lake drained into Oregon and then followed the Columbia River all the way to the ocean. And just like some of these other areas, like the Columbia Gorge and other similar thin bottlenecks where the floods did such a monumental amount of damage, the water would have flowed with just fantastic power. And as a consequence, you have these amazing, amazing towering cliffs of rock on either side of the river. So it's just, again, such an amazing monument to the sheer power of Lake Missoula. And I'm gonna go wander this area and then keep on going. The Wallula Gap is a place that shows Lake Missoula's fury in dramatic form. Here, the waters rampage through at 10 million cubic meters a second, effortlessly destroying vast columns of rock. Two great pillars of hardened stone are all that remains of the towering volcanic columns that once stood. Witnesses to cataclysmic devastation. When chasing Lake Missoula, history comes to life in a profound way. Memories of the past felt deeply. This area of the Columbia Plateau was home to the Cayuse people, who told stories of the epic features left behind by the floods. A place where the ancient and modern are deeply intertwined, where Lewis and Clark looked up at volcanic monuments, knowing little of their violent formation. Paths and roads leading to worlds unknown. The Wallula Gap in many ways is a gateway to the past, where floodwaters and settlers both profoundly changed the world beyond its walls. And 13,000 years after Lake Missoula went silent, a vagabond full of wonder brought the place to life. Okay, so I'm at a wildlife refuge east of the Columbia Gorge, and this was the site of another of the temporary lakes that Lake Missoula formed on its route to the ocean. And this was a lake called Lake Condon, and like Lake Lewis and these other temporary lakes, it stretched for miles and miles and miles in northern Oregon. And while the waters were rushing through the Columbia Gorge, it kind of filled up this temporary lake, and it deposited a lot of soil that it stripped out from the scablands. And that nice, pleasant silt is really excellent for farming. And at this wildlife refuge, you can see these plants behind me grown as wildlife habitat. They owe that existence thanks to these floods and the soil that they stripped from Washington and deposited it out here. So it's just kind of amazing that something as simple as just a group of crops that you see sitting here owes its existence to a cataclysmic flood 15,000 to 13,000 years ago. It's just pretty amazing to be at that point of the cycle where you have the significant violence through the restrictions and then places where the water was just a little bit more settled and was able to drop some of the silt here and benefit us all these years later. Where water can be found, the vegetation that grows on the old floor of Lake Condon grows a spectacular green. A tranquil land birthed by waters and waiting. Verdant paradise sprung from the ancient echoes of Lake Missoula. Once under up to 1,000 feet of water, beautiful trees now stretch skyward. The landscape speaks of Lake Missoula's story. If there's one thing the floods have taught me, it's that the past is not merely the past, but a tangible thing that permeates our world. You know, there's something really cool about this Lake Missoula trip. Is just sort of transitioning between these zones of utter devastation and just these violent forces cascading through mountains and carving them out and creating giant gulfs in the landscape and scarring out the soil. But then you have these interludes, these periods where they created these large lakes. And it has a very different feel to it. You know, all the silt from eastern Washington that it dropped here to allow that kind of plant growth. It's just fantastic. It feels almost serene in a way that certainly disappears once you get into places like the Columbia Gorge. As soon as those bottlenecks happen, you'll remember just how powerful of a beast you're dealing with Lake Missoula. So it's nice to experience the full range that comes with what happened with the Lake Missoula Floods. And pretty soon, we're off to the gorge. Like the floods themselves, I wouldn't stay here for long and was destined for the Columbia Gorge. Okay, well, I am now at the Columbia Gorge, And the Columbia Gorge was the natural drainage area for the Columbia River, and the Lake Missoula Floods, when they happened, definitely noticed the available space and just followed the path of the Columbia River. And when it was going through, it was just this massive, massive wall of mud and stone and fallen trees. And you can imagine, you know, mastodons having been picked up by the water and then thrown into the distance. And while it was passing through the Columbia Gorge, this wall of water was as much as 1,000 feet tall and moving 65 plus miles an hour. Just these rapid, fast force of nature that went through and helped carve the gorge into one of the most spectacularly beautiful sections of Oregon and Washington, and visited by tons of people every year. And it owes that intense natural beauty in no small part to Lake Missoula Floods. So I'm gonna go drive the next 80 miles or so through the gorge and visit many of the spectacular places that you can hike and see the history of the Lake Missoula Floods on the way. Hiking the trails in the Columbia Gorge, you're walking through a world crafted by epic forces of nature. Boulders floated by icebergs kidnapped by raging floodwaters line the trail. Volcanic columns exposed to the world by rising water turn violent. A peaceful day in the aftermath of Ice Age cataclysm. As you ascend the hills, it's easy to envision walking into islands of safety, refuge from floodwaters that exceeded 1,000 feet in height as they rampage through the Columbia Gorge. Upward into views of immense wonder. Well, I'm at the, it's not the true summit. The true summit is a little ways that way, but for the loop that I'm taking, this is it. That was quite a climb though. It was, 1,300 feet up to here. But man, what a spectacular view of the gorge. Just beautiful, beautiful blue waters from the Columbia. And you can just see the sculpted hillsides carved out by the Lake Missoula Floods. Just those sheer cliffs scarred by muddy water. And it's so funny, like when I was looking at this trail network, I saw somebody write a review, a 1-star review that said, "Don't waste your time, just rocks, no bathrooms, no signs." And then you take a look at that and it's just, you know, there's just a slight amount of patience, a slight amount of effort. And you can be rewarded by utterly spectacular views, made more spectacular by understanding the epic geologic history of what happened here in geologic time, not too long ago at all, at a time where it's very possible that humans would have seen the Lake Missoula Floods. Just incredible. Chasing Lake Missoula isn't just about bringing light to the past, but to the present. Seeing the remarkable world we live in as it truly is, a place born by monumental events that created the places that I and so many others dearly love. Okay, well I'm now deep into the Columbia Gorge, and unlike a lot of the other areas of the Missoula Floods, a lot of the geology isn't quite as super apparent because, as you can see around me, it's really heavily forested. Lots and lots of trees sort of covering up the rocky, torn slopes, but the result of the Lake Missoula Floods are very, very obvious in the waterfalls that cascade down these cliffs that were torn away by Lake Missoula Floods. And during the Columbia Gorge, the magnitude of some of these floods were astonishing. At their highest peak, these floods were over 1,000 feet tall. Massive, vast walls of water just crashing through the gorge and just tearing apart the landscape in their wake. So I'm gonna go visit some of these waterfalls and look at some of the remnants of some of these amazing, amazing events. In the Columbia Gorge, you can find hidden treasures concealed in the rainforest green. Rocks lifted skyward by forces deep in the earth. Water flows down cliffs made vertical by Lake Missoula's waters. A tranquil paradise. Such are the gifts of Lake Missoula. Okay, well today we're going to be going up the Angel's Rest Trail. This is a trail in the more forested section to the Columbia Gorge, and unlike a lot of the kind of thick cover, it gives some really fantastic views of the gorge itself, and you can start to see the vast damage the floods put in so many thousands of years ago. The forests of the Columbia Gorge hold stories of epic wonders of nature. From the hillside, memories of the Lake Missoula floodwaters come to life. A verdant land risen from Ice Age calamity. From above, you can feel the force of the 1,000-foot deep wall of muddy water. Listen deeply, and you can hear the roar of the ancient floods. A violent past carving a landscape of breathtaking beauty. Here, I smile a grateful smile. We live in a world full of wonders. You know, there's something just amazing about being out here in this part of the Columbia Gorge. Knowing just what passed through, the idea of a 1,000-foot deep, violent, muddy wall of water traveling 65 miles an hour down this precipice. But then thinking about the amount of regrowth that has happened here. All of the greenery that the Columbia Gorge is famous for, the rain sprouting out these vast rainforests. And it really puts it into perspective that even a torrential flood that destroys entire landscapes, levels them down into vast chasms, from out of that grows this astonishing beauty and and I can't help but feel grateful to be on this path where I can document this for you. It's really just such an amazing experience being out here. The majesty of the Columbia Gorge is made all the more remarkable by its profound history. Okay, well, I'm in Beacon Rock State Park, and Beacon Rock State Park is named after the massive island of rock up there called Beacon Rock that was carved out by the Lake Missoula Floods. And it really just shows you the magnitude of these things when you have this lone isolated island hundreds and hundreds of feet high, just carved out like it's nothing. You exist in this space of flatness, and then you realize that you're standing hundreds of feet below what would have been the surface before the Lake Missoula Floods came through. And there are just many of these amazing monuments to the sheer raw power of those floods. And this is one of them now. The fallen boulders by Beacon Rock tell a silent story of violent catastrophe. Walking to a temple to Ice Age enormity. Beacon Rock, the hollow core of a volcano torn to pieces by a glacial lake let free. Hardened walls are all that remains. Up the rock, a trail leads to views of vast wonder. Here, muddy floodwaters 800 feet deep tore a volcanic mountain to pieces. A landscape shaped by the repeated epic collapse of an ice dam 400 miles away. And in the aftermath of that remarkable event, I walk the place in wonder. From the spectacular views of Beacon Rock, I worked my way west, where the waters filled a verdant valley, now home to many millions of people, and gifted its soils. Okay, I got here before daylight ran out. So right now, I'm at the Kalama Narrows, and this is this little restriction in the Columbia River that played a really, really important role in the Lake Missoula story. Because just like some of these other restrictive areas that the floods followed, only so much water can move through this section of the Columbia River. And as a consequence, a huge amount of Lake Missoula got blocked up and began to form another one of these temporary lakes that had existed along the path of the Lake Missoula Floods. And this lake, Lake Allison, stretched all the way from this area north of Portland down to Eugene, Oregon, and settled with something like 400 feet of water in this vast valley. And in this vast valley, it deposited these astonishing soils that Lake Missoula had ripped out from the surface of Washington and created some rich, rich farmland, world class, known for its amazing soils. And these soils were brought here by the actions of the Lake Missoula Floods, repeating over and over and over again. Through the verdant Willamette Valley of Western Oregon, you can find signs of an astonishing Ice Age story. lush greenery born from soils brought from some of the largest floods ever known. On the hillside, a remarkable, mysterious traveler. Okay, well, one of the final stops in this Lake Missoula story, and just as remarkable as all the others, is a place called the Willamette Valley. And this is an area that, while Lake Missoula was draining into the Pacific Ocean, it created another one of these gigantic lakes that lasted a week while Lake Missoula drained through into the Pacific. And the sizes of these lakes are absolutely staggering. This is a lake that stretched all the way from an area north of Portland south to Eugene, Oregon. Just many, many, many miles of water, hundreds of feet deep. And especially importantly for this area of Oregon, it brought with it huge amounts of the soil from eastern Washington that was stripped away in the scablands and then deposited in this lake and others, while the rest of it went out to sea. And with that soil also came these massive, massive rocks. These are rocks that were carried by glaciers, frozen inside giant glaciers that were floated with the Lake Missoula floods. You can just imagine the size of some of the ice bodies to carry a rock that weighs, I believe they said this one weighs 90 tons. The largest they found are somewhere around 200 tons. Just vast, vast boulders being carried along in huge pieces of ice. And apparently a lot of these ice pieces were floated westward because the winds in the area predominantly went west. And so in the west, you can find lots of these giant rocks. So it's just amazing to think about that not only was this a massive, massive lake that was only in existence for about a week at a time, but within that lake, it basically just fertilized the area where millions of people live in Oregon. It's staggering. It's mind-blowing. You know, the impact that these historical events can have on the lives people live is so often just underthought about and underknown. But I get to tell a story, and that's why I'm here. Boulders like this are more than a curiosity of a long gone past, but a conduit, a connection to an ancient world that birthed where we are today. To a time that the American cheetah and giant sloths still roamed the continent. From a glacier that reminds us we live in a wonder-filled world. The Willamette Valley in northern Oregon is one of the most productive and fertile landscapes in the United States. And behind this greenery, there lies a spectacular story. The soils in which countless crops are planted were brought here from eastern Washington by the astonishing power of Lake Missoula's megafloods. The gift of life brought by Ice Age destruction. So driving through the Willamette Valley is just such a crazy experience. You know, this is such a beautiful, rich, productive area, and it just stretches on for miles and miles and miles. Just all of this green, these apple orchards and farm fields, and just every last inch of it just covered in farmland and towns and cities. And it's really quite amazing to think that all of these people who live here owe their existence of their home as they know it to the Lake Missoula floods, bringing in vast quantities of soil from Washington, depositing it on the lake floor in the temporary Lake Allison while the rest went out to sea. And you can see the remains of it everywhere. When you drive past a lot of the buildings out here or the parks and places, you'll see these just sharp boulders that are often stacked next to properties as decoration. And you wonder how many people realize where those come from. That every single one of them took a ride in a glacier all the way from Montana through these astonishing floods and the vast, vast scale that brought them here, and that this green wonderland is a green wonderland because of Lake Missoula, because the Clark Fork River was dammed and exploded so many thousands and thousands of years ago. The power of ancient history to sculpt the landscapes we live in today is put on fantastic display by Lake Missoula. And in the next video, we visit its final resting place, into the vast Pacific Ocean. Where the Columbia River ends, Lake Missoula would spill into the Pacific Ocean for the last time 13,000 years ago. Profound events lost in memory. It is here on the Oregon coastal shores that we end our story. Okay, well this is it. I'm at the Pacific Ocean, and this is the ocean where the Lake Missoula Floods finally emptied out after their massive journey that's gone along these incredible paths and left all those remarkable features in the landscape. This isn't really the exact point where the floods would have emptied, because at the time the sea levels were much, much lower, and so the actual shoreline is well out to sea and is not somewhere where I can actually explore. But anything that Lake Missoula didn't deposit in the temporary lakes, it took out to sea, and it left numerous scars in the actual ocean. You can find underwater ridges and things like that, scars in the actual landscape that came from Lake Missoula and its astonishing floods. And it just feels so amazing to be back here. This is where it all ends. This is where Lake Missoula's final terminus was, and this is the end of this particular journey. And it's just been such a blast seeing so many of the amazing landscapes and places formed by Lake Missoula and bringing its incredible wonder to life. This is certainly not the end of my filming. I'm very soon going to be going on a journey that'll take me back to the desert Southwest. But for now, this will be the end of this particular story. I hope you're able to learn things about these incredible events and have a new appreciation for Lake Missoula and the amazing wonders that it crafted. And just, you can feel the sheer magnificence and power and violence of these incredible events and how they impacted the world we live in right now. So, till next time, wonder and wonder. As I walked to the ocean until I could walk no more, a profound joy filled my heart. It's the joy of knowing the world, of hearing the stories that nature has yearned to tell but were forgotten in time. Stories of a titanic lake and its floods that would change the world. And a lake that would inspire a wandering filming vagabond 13,000 years after it last disappeared. And what a journey we had. Epic landscapes left by the scars of Lake Missoula's wrath. I was grateful to tell you this story and hope that it inspires you as much as it did me. And until we meet again, wander in wonder.